So welcome. We're going to be talking about podcasting in the classroom. We are both MLTI ambassadors. My name is Rob Dominic. I have been serving as an MLTI ambassador for 2 years now, coming to the end of my term. And prior to this, I was teaching middle school math at Brewer Community School.
My name is Joshua Schmidt. I am also an MLTI ambassador. This is my first year. I also was a middle school math teacher at China Middle School for 5 years and 7 years before that. So, if you don't like anything in this presentation, you can blame the middle school math teachers because you got Rob and I together here.
Yep. And it's pretty amazing, in my opinion, that both of us have kind of gotten so much into this podcasting piece coming from middle school math, which some people might think is probably the hardest place to integrate podcasting into that type of classroom, but we both kind of developed this passion and this knowledge for podcasting, so we hope that we can help you with yours as well. The whole purpose of this presentation is be able to give you a background of podcasting, kind of a quick summary of it, kind of the elements that go into it, and then also leave you with strategies and resources to help integrate it into your own classrooms.
And like Rob said, one of the reasons why we are excited about talking about this is I think both of us came in to this project a little bit skeptical of how we could use it in our content in our curriculum. And the more that we've done it through this role, the more we've realized that this fits really naturally into a lot of the great projects that teachers already do. And so we're going to show you some resources and ideas to see not only how you can use podcasting, but how you can use podcasting without having a huge extra lift in your classroom design. So when we talk about the purpose of podcasting, I actually came into this role having done a failed podcast myself 5 years ago. And so I came in with the perspective of here's what you don't do, and understanding that kind of fitting within the purpose of your podcast is really important and valuable. And when you think about it in a classroom perspective as well, those purposes are just as important, but you don't need to do all of them simultaneously. So if you could have, an expository demonstrating knowledge of a topic, you could also have something that's a narrative that's more story-based, or something that's more totally informational. And of course, you have entertainment. And seeing how students have all of these perspectives from podcasting outside the classroom can help you inform what you can do inside of it as well.
So there are quite a few popular podcast types. Now, there are definitely mixes and matches to a lot of these. They're not just kind of discrete on their own. A lot of it can be blended. But kind of we've sectioned it into 6 different type of categories here that you can be aware of as you're kind of discussing this with your own students or exploring them yourself. You have the interview piece, right, where you're having an interview with a person on the topic that's involved in it. And again, that could be part of a podcast. The rest of the podcast could be conversational, number 2 there, where you're talking about a particular topic. And then you cut to an interview with somebody who has a different point of view, who can't be part of the original conversation, but you want to include them. Monologue piece, again, that's a single host where they're just talking about their experience with that topic. You can make it more storytelling or investigative. I know, what is it, the crime podcast. I know that's a really big popular theme out there. I haven't dug into it myself, so I can't really talk about it. I just know I hear a lot about people listening to it. Roundtable discussion is another popular one, and then of course a theatrical, where it's more like an audio book or a performance that way. And again, they can mix and match. You can have little bits here and there that can go together instead of just having them separate. Just to kind of touch on the benefits of it. Why is it becoming so popular, right? There is an uptick in it. People are liking podcasts a lot. You can put it on in the car. You can put it on when you're walking the dog, mowing the lawn. Honestly, that's my common piece there is when I'm mowing the lawn, I have it in, or any long car ride. We have it on. There's kid podcasts. You can have it on in the car for any young children. So they are definitely portable. That's one of the big benefits. You don't have to be watching a video the whole time. You can take your eyes off the screen, which is pretty beneficial at this point in our lives where there's a lot of screen time. They're personable, right? You can find your own topic, your own interest, because there's a lot of options out there. And then you can build a network, right? So as you're listening to that, you might recommend another piece, another podcast that talk about a similar topic. You can get a kind of well-rounded point of view about this topic that you're interested in. And then, of course, you can only go even deeper. If you want to really build a network, you can check out the website that it is, any resources that that particular person offers around that topic. You can really dig into it and build it out as much as you want.
And going along with what Rob just said about that network, one of the things that we've really enjoyed after working on this ourselves is that there are tons of podcasts out there that fit the needs that you already have. So for me, like looking for, technology integration options, those podcasts exist, and there's some that are extremely good, but you can also bring them into the classroom as well. There are some huge focuses on classroom focused podcasts or, young children that can be really powerful. So when we think about integrating this into your classroom, something Rob and I are going to talk a lot about today is that we don't want this to be in addition to what you already do. We want this to fit naturally into the structure that you already have. So if we're thinking about some stuff that we could do with podcasting or stuff that you do now and could replace with podcasting, think about like a class presentation, something that all of your schools already do in some fashion. You could have students create that presentation as a podcast. So now every student is presenting simultaneously, can be a huge time saver. You could have all of those small group discussions that are going on in your classroom where you can only be present in one at a time. All of a sudden, you can record those as a roundtable discussion. And now you can be hearing all of the valuable discussions that your students are having simultaneously. You could do some type of visual presentation, and you can replace it with a podcast as a way to allow more accessibility for the students that you have in your classroom. But it also could be used for students who are very shy, and we're looking for alternate avenues for them to talk about what they learned and showcase that learning. A podcast is another option there. And of course, we do video reflections on stuff that we've seen in our classroom. Changing that video reflection into an audio reflection could get you different avenues of what your students are thinking about and different ways that you can get some more of that critical thinking and problem solving that we're always searching for our students. And this infographic put together here is something that Rob did that really opened my eyes to how ubiquitous podcasting already is outside of the classroom. So by bringing it into the classroom, you already have that engagement and that hook for your learners. We have 100 million projected podcast listeners by 2024. The most popular ages of podcast listeners are with students 12 and up, and also to adults up to 34. And a third of all podcasts are actually designed for entertainment, which is a huge number. And what I think is really cool, because Rob and I both do this with our own children, is a lot of parents listen to podcasts with their kids as well, up to 63%. So if we're thinking also about kind of the groups that you have in your classroom, you have podcasting right now is slanted more male than female. So that's another avenue to try to get more of your learners engaged in that learning process. And also podcasting has some genres that we don't necessarily see in other avenues of education. That I was actually very surprised to hear that music and comedy are far and away the most popular genres of podcasts, which obviously showcases that what I'm listening to is not the same thing that my students are listening to, which means if we can bring them into the classroom, I'm going to have a little bit more engagement with those kids. And also those age breakdowns, 6 to 17, all of them have a substantial number of our kids who are already listening to podcasts in their free time.
So as we mentioned before, right, we want to be able to try to integrate this across curricular. So we want to be able to have some suggested examples for you about maybe get your gears going about how you could incorporate these into your content. So we've got a recommended chart here for you with math, science, ELA, social studies, and then a generic related arts. Obviously, that doesn't cover everything. But again, maybe it gets your gears going about how you could alter it for your own particular situation. Back to the math piece, yes, right. There's not a straightforward. We're not reading a book in there that we can do a podcast and discuss it together. But doesn't mean we can't have that benefit from that discussion piece, right? That's one piece that is missing from math class often, is being able to let students discuss their work and reflect. And we know that reflection is real spot where learning takes place, right? That's where people adjust and fix their thinking or reorganize it or look at it in a different way. So we want the students to be able at least to reflect on their experiences in math. So that's one big way you could do it in math class. You could have a collection of reflections over a unit, and that could be your podcast. That could be the structure for it, the unit reflections, and each time it's kind of posted. The other idea potentially in math class is be able to have real life math. I've thought about this for my middle school class quite often, where you'd be able to have students, anytime they come across a real life situation, like, oh, hey, I saw that, or I used that skill. Again, I'm biased towards middle school math, or we are, because we feel like there's a lot of integration in real life with the content that we teach. So you could have a podcast there where students just discuss, real life examples of where they saw that content outside of the classroom. Science class, you're looking at being able to showcase growth through a project. Again, you can have the reflection piece and have them talk through what's going on. ELA, again, examine texts through a discussion, learn more about the authors and their writing process, so they could be using podcasts and listening to them, but then also making their own. And then they could be doing book report. They could do their own reviews, right? You could have a collection of those as their book reports, kind of instead of the old school dioramas that I remember, and I don't think they're really happening anymore, honestly. I don't think they're as popular making those things. Social studies, you're looking at another way to discuss historical events, or maybe having mock interviews, right? You could have people play the roles of certain situations that are going on, whether you're talking about like ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, to Civil War characters, right? You can kind of incorporate it any way that way. And then related arts, again, some of them are a little bit more difficult, I think. Gym class was one that we kind of struggled with, finding a true good way to incorporate it instead of just kind of a superficial way. But obviously you could explore music and how it sets the tone and the mood in podcasts. And then also, art, art class, you could be comparing and contrasting works of famous art and having that discussion through the recordings.
And just like with what Rob said right there, some content areas are going to be easier to integrate than others. But what we both were really excited to see is that, especially when I first thought about podcasting, I thought the only way to use it is that my students create a podcast that we then present other places. There are actually tons of other examples, and being able to use those different situations are how you can make these projects cross-curricular as well. If you're thinking about exploring the role of music with mood, we could be creating the podcast in one class, but we could be examining podcast examples in another class and also talking about how those things are interconnected. So when we talk about various entry points, that's exactly what we're talking about. Is can you use podcasts in your classroom without your students just having to directly make an entire podcast? And there are tons of ways for this to work. So the first one is evaluative. You could have your students evaluate an existing podcast and the arguments made within. Once again, this is a type of learning that we do across the spectrum, all over the place, where students need to evaluate arguments they hear and compare and contrast how they would make those arguments slightly different. We could also have conversation. Then instead of thinking about the podcast as a finished product, we're thinking about it as the learning process, where you could have students simply recording a discussion that they have and go back and listen to it later and use that as an avenue to create even more authentic discussions in your classroom. We also, and this is what I've been really enjoying myself, is the actual editing of the podcast itself can be an incredibly valuable learning opportunity, especially in music, audio, computer science avenues, where the editing itself is a really powerful skill that we could teach our students. And this is another avenue to make it more cross-curricular. And finally, you could do the truly highly edited process across all content areas, all spectrums, where you're making a true high quality podcast that your students could create. But it's important to remember that you can enter in any one of those points, and you don't have to feel like you have to do all of it at once. And so understanding that podcasts can replace stuff you already do, make it a little bit more efficient or a little bit more effective, can be a really effective way to enter into this skill.
All right. So we've kind of given you a background of podcasting, some of the elements that go into it, how we see it fitting, and kind of the why behind it. Um, so now we want to make sure again you have an entry point, as Josh just kind of talked about. What are some ways to get going with this project? And our goal is not here to be able to get deep into every little bits, right? We don't want to take that much time. It'd be like a 3-hour recording, and you'd be asleep 45 minutes in. So our goal here is to be able to kind of give you some ideas to get going with it, maybe explore some other resources that we have offered or others have offered, so that you can you build from there over time. So nothing's going to be too deep, but we are going to give you some suggestions about how to get started and where that entry point is. So this was a outline made from another ambassador of ours, Tracy Williamson, who did a really great job. She has a separate presentation that you can check out. It's linked on here. And I'm just kind of showing you a few of the pieces here that we would recommend just scratching the surface of it. If you're going to be podcasting in your classroom, the very first thing is why. What's the goal of it? Who's the audience? What information do you want to do? What are you trying to accomplish? Kind of going back to that integration suggestions that we had. What is your goal with it? Where are you going with it? And then after that, if you're going to be having kids create the podcast, take some time and have them discover it, have them listen together. Odds are at first it's going to be very superficial listening, right? Just on the surface of what they're hearing. And then you can bring up the different elements to it, which we're going to be talking about in a minute, that you can be looking for. But you can dig into it and say, all right, what do you notice about the music? What do you notice about their articulation? What do you notice about how they're conveying the information, right? You can kind of get them going from there. Those are definitely the very first 2 steps that we recommend you take. After that, you can kind of pick and choose what direction to go in. Do you want to have, defined roles for everybody? How are you doing this? Is it going to be in groups? They definitely would need some roles so they understand what they're working on. You could brainstorm segments as a class if you're going that large one, or maybe it's just a quick 4-minute discussion and you just want them to record that. So again, you may or may not need that step. And then so on and so forth with all of these down there, right? How deep do you want to go with the editing, with the music and sounds? Do you want them to make fading in and out with transitions? Or do you want to just have them maybe drop some music in, just leave it as it is, and get used to the process, right? There's plenty of resources, which we'll give you later on as well, that you can do that with. So things that you might be listening for and looking for while you're talking with students about the podcasts, right? You're talking about the preparation piece, right? Think about how well does something come across? Does it sound prepared? Is there a natural flow to it? Was there an interview involved, and how did those questions get asked, and what direction were they going with that interview? What kind of personality comes out with that podcast? What kind of tone is being set? Again, is it a comedy one, as Josh mentioned, or is it entertainment? Is it the crime investigation? Is it comedy? Right? What's the tone, and how is that personality coming through that podcast? I would add to that as well, kind of the music piece, maybe thinking about how the music adds to that, depending on that. I think that's personality, that fits under the personality heading. Articulation, right? Notice how people are saying their information, right? How are they being able to make sure they slow down and be able to say their words and make it clear without sounding too robotic, where they're too slow and then not being able to have any personality, right? How are they able to, articulate the information to everybody? And then, of course, enthusiasm, right? If this is a project a student's going to be making, or if you're listening to a podcast, odds are it's because you want that niche of topic, right? You're interested in it. Whoever's making it is probably interested in it. So there should be some enthusiasm to be able to, bring that topic to life for the listener. All great things to be able to checking out with your students as you're exploring them.
And along with what Rob is saying here about how valuable these all are, these are the same skills we want our students to be able to have on any type of presentation. And so once again, with the idea that podcasts don't necessarily have to be an addition or an extra, they can take something that already exists in your classroom and just make it a little bit better. I also think it's very funny. Rob and I joke all the time about how when we listen to podcasts ourselves, you get hypersensitized to all of these different components. When you're thinking about them so much, you'll listen to someone's podcast, be like, "Ooh, if they did a musical transition there, that really would have helped set the tone for that next portion." And so you can teach your kids to also think critically through these same activities as well.
And then you learn a lot about yourself too. I can't tell you how many times I've listened to our own work that we've done and be like, "Oh gosh, I need to stop saying that," or "Why can't I slow down and say the word I want?" Like it just you learn a lot about yourself as well. But it's not as high stakes because it's just audio. For some reason, it doesn't hit as hard as the visual piece. Seeing myself and then hearing myself at the same time mess up is different than just hearing it. Like it hits differently.
Yeah, and it hits differently for the kids too. There's just something that's a little bit less high stakes. I love how you said that, Rob. The kids will take more risks here. And the fact that they can go back and edit a little bit easier makes that risk taking a little bit safer. And it is such a fun activity to do with kids. So, a couple elements to consider, and something that I wrote down here for these is that think about how, as the teacher of the classroom, that you don't need to focus on all of these simultaneously. You can pick and choose. So if something is really important to you, you can assess that piece without having to assess all of the other pieces as well. So, like Rob had talked about in the last slide, the introduction is a really good place to set up that tone and personality for the listener. If that's really important to you in the presentation component of the podcast, then that's the part that you could put a lot of time and energy into. Conclusion, very similar here, but it's more of like an English philosophy of making sure you've wrapped up the arguments in a clear and concise way and made it obvious what the arguments that you're making are. And then you have the editing components that are mixed in as well. If you're in a computer science classroom or you're teaching a specific resource or technology, the music and sound elements could be a component that you put a lot of energy into, or the transitions, like Rob said, the how to blend two pieces together, have music transitions that increase or decrease, or even music segments between that kind of make those cuts a little bit more natural. As the teacher who's bringing podcasts in the classroom, you don't have to do all of these simultaneously, and focusing on one or two at a time can really make it clear to your students what you care the most about. And it gives you great avenues to bring in other content areas and other teachers into these projects. So, creation resources. So we use for our podcast on the MLTI 2.0 team, shameless plug, Teaching with Tech. We will be putting links to that later. We use 4 resources that you could use in a classroom setting. And we want to talk about why some of these resources are really, really effective and why some of these resources have weaknesses, and understanding that all of them have strengths and weaknesses and figuring out which fits best for you. The resource that we use the most for recording and editing is called Soundtrap. Soundtrap is web-based, which means that it can work on almost any device that has internet access. So for schools that have Chromebooks, this would be one of the first resources that we would recommend using. We love Soundtrap for the fact that you can record tracks simultaneously, and it's free. And we have used it entirely free for our entire life of our podcast, and it has worked really, really well for that purpose. However, Soundtrap does have some reliability issues. We had one episode that was about a week late on our normal schedule because Soundtrap wasn't letting us mix those. That's something you can't get around in a web-based app. There is a little bit of a learning curve with Soundtrap, but that learning curve comes with a lot of strength in the program itself. There's a lot of things that you can do. You just kind of have to figure out how to do it first. And freemium is limited. An example of this would be the audio, where you can make sound increase and decrease on one specific track. You can only do that with one track in the free version. But if you're learning the basics of the software, usually Soundtrap is enough to do that. Now, if we're thinking of podcasting in a video format, which Rob and I both argue that you can use video within a podcasting format, it doesn't necessarily change the goals of what you're doing. WeVideo is really nice because it has, once again, it is web-based, so it works very well for any school that has computers like Chromebooks, but it can be used on almost any device. It has that royalty-free music included. So if you wanted to add music into your transitions, your intros, your outros, it's already there. It's really, really good for that. And WeVideo has a low learning curve compared to other similar resources. It's the type of resource you can jump in, learn in a day, and then start building with the next day. In the negatives of WeVideo, the freemium only allows for 5 minutes a month. So it's probably good for one project at a time. And the way WeVideo makes money is that the quality of your final product is based upon the account type you have. So the free version has lower quality, which once again, if you're doing a podcast format and you just need the audio at the end, not a huge deal. If you're doing a video-based one, could be a bit of a negative. GarageBand, which is Mac only, is very, very powerful, and it is free. So it compares really nicely to Soundtrap. It is more powerful than Soundtrap. It is a little bit more beginner friendly than Soundtrap, but it's not web-based. So there's no collaboration between your students. It's Mac only. And it means that those types of things can be kind of tricky to work around. But if you're looking for just a high quality product and you have Macs in your school, GarageBand is awesome. It's really, really good. And Anchor is where we publish our podcast. Anchor is very easy for publishing on our podcast. After the setup was done, we were able to publish on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and YouTube Music, all with one link, which is really, really nice. It is free, which is excellent. However, it is ages 14 plus, and the episodes are published straight to Spotify through that Anchor account. So you do lose a little bit of control over that, and that can bring privacy concerns that you need to be cognizant of when you're working on this type of project. We also have put in a lot of links that we want you to use. We're going to give you the bit.ly link at the end here. Please come to this slide and look through these if you're interested, or reach out to Rob or I. We would love to be helpful for any teacher who is thinking of using podcasts in their classroom.
And if you kind of check as we have this series, kind of preparing you for podcasting in the classroom, there is going to be a short tutorial, kind of an intro to each one of those resources for you, just kind of an entry point so you can see the key features anyways that you're looking for those. So you can check that out as well. So just to comment on our process, kind of give you some real example of what we're doing as you know, pretty much amateurs doing this, but doing it for our MLTI DOE profession here, and slowly building out our amateur status. Our process here is outlined where we start with the plan, right? We do a pre-session planning where we outline as a group who's going to be hosting it, who's going to be joining it. Right now there are 8 MLTI ambassadors, soon to be 10 as three of us switch out and come to end of our term. So we need to know who's going to be involved in it in that particular episode and what roles they're going to be having, and then kind of discuss what's the flow going to be, what's our goal for that podcast, what are some key questions we want to hit. So we do plan it out and we script out a little bit of it, but a lot of ours is discussion based. So we want to make sure that we allow for that freedom to discuss as we go along. But we do want to make sure we make it you know, meaningful enough that we hit on key points. Then, of course, we record the audio through Soundtrap, as Joshua just mentioned. It allows us to record separate tracks simultaneously, so the editing process becomes easier. We're not sharing and emailing files back and forth after we're done, as long as Soundtrap is working. Then we go through and edit. We've come up with a pretty smooth way where we all have different roles. There's about 3 of us. We edit it. You know, one person does interview piece, the other person does the actual discussion, and then another person kind of puts it all together and it gets our transitions smooth. So we divide up that work and then be able to bring it together. Finalize, we do a lot of our finalizing work in GarageBand, because again, as Joshua said, there's a lot of great features on there, and we do have some MacBook accessibility, so we can put all the pieces back together through GarageBand, because while we record on Soundtrap without the paid version, some of the features we want are limited. So we can record on there, put it out to GarageBand, and finish the key pieces that have the full features there. Then finally, the sharing piece. We, as Josh mentioned, use Anchor because it's a free sharing piece. A lot of platforms charge for sharing out podcasts. But just like in the classroom, right, you know, in our role, if we can find free versions or free opportunities, we're going to take advantage of it. So we use Anchor, but again, once you put it on Anchor and upload it, it does go directly to Spotify. So there could be some COPA issues there depending on the age of students. But then we also take that and we put it on YouTube, we put it on Apple Podcasts, we put it on Google Podcasts with the RSS feed. So it does give that out. So we can spread it to other places. When we were first when we were first doing this, we were wondering, the type of equipment, so what comes to mind for me is always with the Saved by the Bell episode, because I loved watching that as a kid. So as the Saved by the Bell episode where they have their big studio, right, and they've got all this equipment, and like, oh, they have a radio show, right, similar to a podcast piece. So I'm like, oh, you need all this stuff, right? You think it has to be some grandiose plan, but it's not. Doesn't have to necessarily be that way. Especially in the classroom, you need a laptop, of course, right? Headphones, because when you're recording and somebody's talking to you, you don't want them they're talking to be on your recording. So headphones. We do recommend a better mic. Some laptop microphones are fine, again, depending how quality and how much quality control you want on it. You can use that no problem, especially if you're starting out. But as you get going, it's one of those like upgrade pieces, right? Just like anything, any hobby you have, right? You get started with the basics and then you upgrade little by little, like, oh, this would be nice if I had this other version. Well, a better mic does go a long way. You can listen to some podcasts out there and they have like some screeching, or they've got some feedback on the mic piece, and it's not pleasing to the ears and it's hard to listen through. So the mic helps. And then finally, honestly, a cell phone. Like we do some interviews where we're out in the field, at a conference or something. We want to talk to somebody. We just use good old cell phone. Those have come a long way with their microphones, and you can use that. It does pick up background noise, but that also feels like it's authentic. You can have that personality, right, and that enthusiasm piece that we talked about earlier, with that background noise with a cell phone, and it's okay. So really, just those 4 basic pieces, and odds are you've got a laptop, right? Kids might have their own headphones. So you can get going, and the better mic can come later. Doesn't take too much equipment.
And also, if you're interested in starting this project new, there actually are grants within the DOE that could support that work. If you're interested, we can add those links in the description, but the most recent one is called Teach with Tech, that would fit within this type of belief and philosophy. And so there are ways to reduce that cost and still get high quality work. Rob, we actually didn't practice this part, but I'm curious, since we've started this, what has been the part that's been most successful or most surprisingly successful for your learning by doing these podcast projects?
I just think just kind of appreciating the process to it, is kind of what I've taken away the most. Just the what really goes into a good podcast, like really thinking out your questions, your interview questions, if you're interviewing somebody, what's the flow and the direction you want to go, how to make things go seamless, right? If you're listening to a podcast, it's almost like a good one. You almost get like hypnotized into it, right? You kind of get into it and you get your mind going, and they just kind of keep you there. Whereas if one's maybe not as polished, it has rough transitions, or it has music that just kind of jars you for a second, and it kind of brings you out of that hypnosis state. It's not like you're completely zombie-like, but you're kind of in the moment listening to it. I think I've come to really appreciate that and learn a lot about how that goes, especially, not having to take any real journalism classes. It's kind of piqued my interest. Like maybe there's some edX or course at ERA class I could take about just some basic journalism that goes into this, because I've really come to appreciate that process. How about you?
Really similar. For me, it's the editing has been really fun and difficult in a growth mindset sort of way, but I didn't take nearly enough consideration into the power of the editor. And so when I go back to the classroom, that's one of the projects that I want to try to introduce to my kids, giving them, let's say, a 10-minute interview of me and some other person, and asking them to edit that interview down to 5 minutes, and understanding the power they have to change the tone of that interview. And that's been a really good challenge for me to understand that power. And I think it would be a great lesson to be able to bring to my kids. So thank you for humoring me on that. This has been such a growth a project that I feel like I've improved so quickly. Like I said, I had a failed podcast 5 years ago. I wish I could go back in time and use the information that I know now about purpose and direction, because that has mattered even more than just like the skills to make the episodes themselves.
So very true, honestly, and especially coming two math teachers coming together doing a lot with this. Like there's been a lot of learning, right? And I think you bring up an excellent point that for teachers out there, like that's a great entry point for students as well. Be able to have a model or a sample to work from where it's kind of common around and compare how people cut it, right? It'd be really interesting. How do they cut it? How do they control that narrative about what's being said? It could be quite interesting.
So like we had talked about before, a little bit of a shameless plug here. If you are interested in learning more about our podcast process, the MLTI 2.0 team has launched a new podcast called Teaching with Tech. If you wanted a breakout EDU kit for your classroom or school, we do have prizes that happen once a month, and our current drawing is going to be ending in early May. So we have just finished our month of digital citizenship as our podcast. This month, we are doing podcasting for students. This presentation is part of that process.
So before we kind of give you those resources pieces at the end, we just wanted to touch on, right, what's the publishing piece, right? We hopefully gave you a setup of what direction to go in, how to get started, what it looks like, things to consider, and then now where does it go from there, right? What are our recommendations for the audience, right? The authentic audience in the end. Well, you can think about it in different rings here as we have set up. You've got your obvious immediate classroom reach, right? You've got sharing back with the teacher, maybe with other students, depending how you want to go with it. You can share it back through Google Classroom. You can share it on Google Slides. You can insert audio and have each student have their own, or group have their own slide deck. Maybe they make their own cover art that goes with it, and that's on the slide. And then you have a little button that's the audio for it, and they can put it on there. Again, it depends how long the podcast is. It depends what you're going with it, what direction, but that's what we would recommend from there. Now, if you want to broaden that out, right, and sometimes it is beneficial to have a broader audience. If students say, hey, this is going to be on the school site, or this is going to be sent to just the staff, right? You don't have to break that kind of safe netting of the school environment and put it out publicly. You can still send it out to the staff and keep it in there in that realm. So then that way, you don't have to worry about too many privacy issues. You could put it on a Google site. You could have that a common place for everybody to see. You can email it out to teachers, put it on your morning announcements if you have something similar to that. Or you could go even bigger and put it on a published Google site or website that is public facing out to the community. You could look at putting it on social media for giving links to it. And saying, hey, here's a podcast, whether it's hosted on the website or if you put it on Anchor, whatever it is, you can link to them that way. And then finally, ultimately, right, you've got the broad public reach where you're trying to reach a wide audience, maybe more appropriate for either a teacher-centered podcast where you're doing the podcast and you're bringing in student voices as you go along, or maybe for older students, kind of above, into high school age, you've got the ability to put it on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, Spotify, things like that. So again, another thing to consider, where is it going to end up going? And it could be as simple as sharing it through Google Drive, or as complicated or as far reaching as putting it on a public site.
And like I had talked about earlier, this slide deck is designed for you to go to and use the resources that we talked about today. And we wanted to use resources that were really helpful to us as we were learning this process as well. So here are a bunch of podcasts that are really powerful. On the left is really focusing on younger kids podcasts, like we had talked about before, that is really popular in those smaller age ranges. And also Common Sense Media and Common Sense Education are fantastic resources when talking about making sure you're within a good digital citizenship realm, which we talked about a lot in our March episodes of the MLTI 2.0 podcast. And of course, the thing that we really would like you to do is reach out to Rob or I with any questions that you have at any time. We would love to be able to work with you on understanding how you could use these resources or the tech help on using the softwares most effectively. At the bottom of this screen is the bit.ly link that will bring you to this slide deck to make sure you can click any of the links through anywhere on here. As well, there will be a link to the slide deck in the description of this video as well.
We'd definitely like to thank you all for listening through this. And again, reiterate, reach out with any questions. This is just really meant to get you started. There are lots of other resources out there, as Joshua mentioned, to dig into this deeper. And it should just be the starting point for you. And then thereafter, you'll encounter problems you didn't even foresee. But please look through our resources and options that we have available to you, because we'll hopefully be able to help you through that, or just contact us directly and we'll be able to do that as well.